Well, the trees were clapping their hands last night, weren't they? You saw the remains of it on the road this morning. Quite a violent wind went through. Well, welcome to Ironworks. We are walking back now to what we began last fall, and it's talking about a biblical worldview. And that sounds like a really esoteric, sort of academic kind of exercise. But here's the point. You already have a worldview. The question is, does it align with reality? And so we're making the case that a biblical worldview helps you live in the real world which God created, which He knows best how to navigate. So let's take a look. We're going to just do a little review on the front page of your notes. A worldview is how I see the world. It's like a lens. It's like a framework. And it tells us how it was designed. In other words, is it random? Or was there a plan behind this? Was it created by God? It tells us why things happen the way they do. Not down to the details. It doesn't tell us why that dandelion landed in your yard. But it does tell us about why human nature acts the way it does and why the world works the way it does and why certain things come out. Many people believe in karma or fate. We believe that God has a plan. And then it gets very specific because a biblical worldview helps me see my purpose in it. Why am I here? In all this vastness, in all of creation, and all the things that are happening in humanity, why am I here? What's my meaning and what's my destiny? So it has a real important aspect of our lives. So why do I need a biblical worldview? Well, think about this. Francis Schaeffer said he said this 50 years ago. We live in a post-Christian world. And we've been swimming upstream in this for a long time. It took us a while to recognize it. For a while, that sounded like something that was just happening in philosophy departments in universities, but it affects our schools, our businesses, our media, our sexuality, our civility, our justice system, even our medical ethics. In a post-Christian world, there are no bearings that teach the dignity of humanity and the justice that God wants. So secular humanism is probably the first sign of that, and then it moves into what we've seen politically, which is Marxism and progressivism. What we want to see is a biblical worldview, biblical Christianity that holds its own. Last night we were here for a men's event with Kendall Qualls, and it was an electric evening. I just felt like men were leaning forward. And I've had a couple of conversations with guys, and they're basically saying, did we just hear what we wanted to hear? Well, of course we heard what we wanted to hear, but it was true. It was good to hear someone who is hopeful, someone who's looking at the world from a biblical perspective and saying, how do we go upstream and treat the origins of the malady in our culture, which Kendall would say is fatherlessness? How do we go upstream to treat that, to look at that from a biblical perspective and do it in a positive and proactive way? And that's just one example of how a biblical worldview can impact the way we define the problems that we face. There's progressive and a postmodern worldview, which basically says truth is socially constructed. Are you familiar with that? Socially constructed. In other words, we are deciding what is true. And you see that all over these days, because it's the whole thing that facts don't matter. You know, I can have my own set of facts. There are no absolutes. There's only power. And what the interest there is, what's my personal individual happiness? How do I progress toward my own personal happiness? But a biblical worldview is basically a blueprint from God that says this is how it's designed, and you can look at these pillars that support it. And what we're talking about in this series is the 10 pillars that support a biblical worldview, which are what? The 10 Commandments. We're looking at the 10 Commandments not as just a bunch of rules that you need to memorize, but as windows that open up and show us, look, this pillar supports all kinds of life, and life the way it should be, not only for me, but for my society. And that's what we're looking at. Also, and I gave you this thought, that a biblical worldview explains the one and the many. Remember that concept? No. It supports the concept of the one and the many. In other words, there's one centralizing foundation. And I would say my one is the God who is revealed in Scripture. That's my one. That's the foundation. And when you have that one foundational thing, it explains all the various aspects of life. They integrate back to that one thing. Biblical worldviews explain the one and the many. It's that unifying, rationalizing of all the details of life. And that doesn't mean it's always easy to figure that out, but it does mean there is a core there. So Christianity is a comprehensive worldview, not a series of unrelated doctrines or random devotional thoughts. And that, I think, is the bottom line we're having here. So how can I frame a biblical worldview? We're looking at the 10 Commandments. And there are 10 commandments. There are 613 case laws in the Old Testament that flow from those 10 commandments. So as you read the 10 commandments, you'll see that today, I think, in a good way. And you go through the Old Testament, you say, well, how does this thing about not wearing clothing that's linen and wool, why don't we mix fabric? Well, what does that relate to? Well, it relates somewhere back to one of the Old Testament laws. And it's not just a rule, it's also a teaching thing. So here are the 10 commandments. You've probably memorized them, but I doubt that. But anyway, you know many of them. We're on number 6. You shall not murder. Commandment number 6, you shall not murder. Well, God is the giver of all life. And Jesus said, I have come to give them life and to give it to them abundantly. And the Spirit of God is called the Spirit of life. He shows us how to live that. So this is a Trinitarian origin here, because if we shall not murder, the point is that God is the giver of life, and we need to support that life. When you're surfing through Amazon Prime or Netflix and you're looking for a video to watch, have you noticed that about 90% of them have to do with murder, killing, crime scene investigation, mayhem, horror, warfare, all kinds of killing? We are swimming in a swamp of celebrating, or at least watching, murder. It's brutal, it's gratuitous, and we're living in a world which is increasingly unsafe, not just from war, but right inside our own homes and neighborhoods. And it raises the question for me, is there any generation more guilty of violating the 6th commandment than our generation? You shall not murder. Let me give you some statistics here about our generation. I'll give them to you in just a minute. But when the world looks at murder and when it looks at killing, it really doesn't have any answer to it. It always says, well, what causes this? Is it guns? Is it parenting? Is it economics? Is it the neighborhood? What is causing this? But in the Scripture, we say, well, we know what the cause is. And the cause goes back to the first commandment, which is what? Have no other gods before me. Because the first commandment is the authority source for the 6th commandment. If there's no authority in the universe, if there's no moral authority, if there's no moral absolute, then controlling murder is just a pragmatic problem. And where are they doing this? Somewhere they're paying people not to shoot people. What's that? San Francisco. I don't know exactly how that particular law is working, but they're saying, we will basically give you a bonus if you won't shoot people. I'm not sure how that works, and maybe I don't have it right. But in other words, if there's no conscience, if there's no higher authority that holds us accountable for judgment, then the 6th commandment is just a pragmatic aspect of, well, just don't do it because it's not healthy for people, There's nothing behind it that works. And so here's the bottom line for the 6th commandment. Human life is holy. We talk about the sanctity of human life because, number one, it's created and given by God. And secondly, every human being has within himself or herself the image of God. So that's why you shall not murder. Stated positively, let me give you this sentence. Of all the priorities and treasures on earth, human life is the highest. We honor God by respecting his image in every other person and by protecting and preserving human life through all possible means. That's a lot, but that means that everything from research on fetal stem cells to the care for the oldest person in a nursing home all falls in that pro-life, sanctity of life umbrella. In fact, it predates birth and it postdates death because we believe God is the author of all that life and he knows all of it. And so in the case law of the Old Testament, to support this pillar are rules about malice and vengeance and cruelty and violence. Now think about the Old Testament and the law that was given. How few implements or opportunities or means there were to commit murder. I mean, they didn't have guns. They didn't have all the weapons that we have today. And people were all known. It was a community. It had to be personal, physical violence on purpose in the Old Testament. It couldn't be a random drive-by shooting or something like that. And the case law says that, what's happened in your heart needs to be guarded because that's what leads to murder. It also would prohibit abortion, suicide, euthanasia, genocide and ethnic cleansing, all kinds of politically motivated murder. So what does this say about us? Well, let me just talk about our generation. I said that we're the Holocaust generation. And that's not blaming you in particular, but I'm talking about the 20th century, especially the latter half of the 20th century. So let's take a good look at our generation. George Orwell, whose name is coming up a lot lately, said, if you want a picture of the future, imagine a boot stamping on a human face forever. Doesn't seem so far-fetched, does it? And we've actually seen that in different societies. My thesis is that there's never been a generation that has seen more murder and is more callous and numbed to murder than ours. In World Wars I and II, 25 million soldiers were killed. There are 12 million in other wars of the century. So there's 37 million men and women who have died as combatants in war. So we're not counting that. I'm not counting that as murder. But from 1917 to 1953, Lenin and Stalin shot, tortured, imprisoned, and starved and froze to death 40 million. Think of that, 40 million of their own people. I read a book called The Harvest of Sorrow, and it's about the Ukraine from 1929 to 1932, where the collective farming in the Ukraine took over as the communists took power, and they seized all the private land, and they realized they had a grain shortage, and so they starved the Ukrainian people, systematically starved an entire population. 14.5 million people were systematically starved to death in the Ukraine. That's on top of the other 40 million that died from the gulags and all the other things. The man who wrote this book said, and it was a 400-page book, he said, you can get a perspective on what 14.5 million people looks like when you think that it was 20 human beings for every word in this book. They murdered and imprisoned the priests, the intelligentsia, the business leaders, the community leaders, and they set up the Gulag system in the Soviet Union. In China, the Great Leap Forward in the late 40s, Mao executed 2 million intellectuals and others for crimes, and then 30 million were forced into starvation. collectivizing, and he seized the land. They were class enemies. If you know anything about the Cultural Revolution of the early 60s, the little red book that Mao published, it's ominous to think about what's happening in the streets of America, because there were roving bands of young men and women who would drag a college professor, university professor out on the street. They would spit on him, they would beat him, they would shame him, often kill him. It was just random mayhem. They were tearing down everything so that Mao could stay in power. And it was a lawless time. And let's not forget about Hitler, who killed 6 million Jews and gypsies and other people who were mentally ill. In World War I, 2 million Armenians, not Arminians, not non-Calvinists, but Armenians, were starved to death by the Ottoman Empire. And that's the subject you can't talk about at the UN, but it was real. So when you think about what was happening, what has happened, and then you think of Idi Amin in Uganda, in Ethiopia in the early 80s, 1 million people were starved by the government, starved to death. Pol Pot killed 2 million Cambodians in the killing fields. And then we have Rwanda, Somalia, and Bosnia, in Iran, in Iraq, and Syria. So you add all these people up, and over 100 million were murdered by governments, by policies, not by wars. So that's why I would call this the Holocaust generation. And it continues, and it's not over. And it's not just out there. Because in 1973, we passed the Roe versus Wade law, and since that day, 62 million children have been killed in the womb. So we are not innocent in the United States of this by any means. That's just the American cost. And we euphemistically call this choice. And that is a travesty in itself. China enforced a family policy of one child, and by doing so, forced countless numbers of abortions. And so we're witnesses to this. I mean, we didn't live the whole 20th century, and the 21st century is young. But when you think about "you shall not murder," that applies, and it's happening all around us, with all kinds of implications. So we need to take a close look at our family, our own family, the cheapening of life. We seem to be unaffected by that. I mean, I don't know how we can act on it, but I know that whenever I look at the news, one of the first things I look at or hear about is the murder count in Chicago every weekend. Dozens. Now, I don't want to make any other statement about that other than that's people are focusing on that, but it could be a lot of different cities in our culture, but we're used to hearing that. But here's the point. By age 16, the average child has seen 200,000 acts of violence on television or on video. So we're numbing, we're taking the anesthetic through video and media. We're pumping it into a generation. When you think about the Old Testament, think about the very, very, very few people who ever witnessed a murder. They had to be on the scene in the violence to be there. Well, we see it all the time. It's just a click away, and we're pumping that into our children. There are 10 million violent crimes per year in the United States, and we have 1.8 million people in prison. They're not all murderers by any means, but life is cheap. And then you add to that death-taunting extreme sports, where people just flaunt their lives. Things like driving pickups and bicycling and Motorcycles. No, we're talking about the guys who jump off mountains in their bat suits, and wonder why they don't live very long. But life is precious. Life is precious. It's a gift from God. He created it, and the image of God lives in all of us. And we're not just soulless humanoids. We're not just here. And the problem with our family is my oldest brother was a murderer. Cain. The first brother murdered his brother. That's our heritage. And so the myth is, and this was believed in the 1700s, the myth in England was that if we could identify the criminal class and get them out of here, then England would be a pristine place to live. And you know where they sent them? Australia. Australians don't like to talk about that, but it started as a prison colony. And they thought, well, let's get the criminal class over there. And by the way, most of them died on the way. But then England didn't become this pristine place they thought it would be. Why is that? Because of the human heart. The human heart has evil in it. We are persons who can be racist, we can be violent, we can be killers. And that's my family history. And that's the history of the sinful heart. So let's take a close look at our own hearts, because where does the fault lie? Does the fault lie with guns, or insufficient evidence, or media violence, or malparenting, or ethnic insensitivity, or political ideology? Well, all of those things can contribute. But we know from a biblical worldview that murder originates in the heart. And we have to wonder, if the means had been available when I was outraged, could I have killed someone? And I think the answer is yes. It might have been by accident when he got in the way of that ratchet that flew across the garage. But I have within me the rage that is required to kill someone. It's the human heart. And just to make one point that sounds political, but it's not, it's theological. If there's any one thing that you should recognize that is at the very fault, at the heart of the fault of critical race theory, it's that it blames racism and other evils on a class of people instead of locating it in the heart of every person. So it can't stand because it doesn't have any legs in the real world. Because when you divide people by classes, and one is the oppressor class and one is the oppressed class, what happens when the oppressed class takes over is they just become the oppressor class. And the human heart is not affected. So there's lots of other nuances to that whole issue, but to me it's primarily a theological issue, and every Bible-wielding man, every Bible-believing Christian should recognize, if you locate sin in any other place than the human heart, it's not a biblical worldview. Now, we need to look at our hearts and say, do all those ugly things reside in my heart? Because that's what following Jesus is all about. The transformation that happens when the human heart begins to be reborn and begins to live in that sanctified way. So Cain had in his heart envy and anger and ultimately murder, and that can so easily be in my heart as well. Well, there are all kinds of implications to this in our culture, and if there's anything that we desire, it's that we would go to bed at night and feel safe. And if you're worried about your very life, you're not going to make good decisions. You're not going to have a thriving family. You're not going to have a thriving culture. And so God in his wisdom put this in the 10 Commandments to say, you shall not murder, not just to be a rule out there, but to create a society where we recognize there's a line you cannot cross and needs to be protected. And down through history, believing people, believing Christ followers have always been those on the forefront of preserving and valuing life. And that's our role today in many different ways. So I want you to talk about this around your tables and give some examples. And again, let me just urge you, let everybody get a chance to talk if you want to talk. Nobody has to. But also minimize the sarcasm and maximize the energy that you put into this conversation. So let's talk around the tables about the questions that I've given to you.